Welcome to Studio with your local lay Dominicans. We'll be discussing some of the gems we discovered in our studium, where we share the fruits of our contemplation and the joy of the gospel message. Representing our St. Albert the Great lay Dominican chapter and co-host of today's show are myself, Cheryl Drozda,
Nicholas Drozda,
Matthew Mayer.
and today we're going to be discussing a topic called integralism. It's one of those isms, and I'm not very familiar with it. That's why Matthew is here to give us some information about that. Matthew?
Well, I want to say a brief description of integralism is practically that the church has more authority than the government, and that's already true in itself, but what's really trying to say is that the government must recognize that the church has more authority than it. But what I want to get first addressed is that integralism is not Christian nationalism. The argument for Christian nationalism is that the local church expands to a national church, and the problem with that is that there is no universal church, and because of that, it doesn't have, therefore, authority, because the church as authoritative would have to have universal authority over the entire world, and so in this case, the church would be subject to the government. It is pagan. It is basically the government having more authority than the church.
So you're talking about now Christian nationalism, just to clarify.
Yes, that is Christian nationalism. And honestly, I know some people might say you can't call it pagan because, well, you can talk about the Church of England. But the problem is that whenever, well, I don't want to get like too controversial here, but when I saw that picture of Jesus Christ wearing the MAGA hat, I thought, yeah, he's no longer King of Kings and Lord of Lords in this case anymore. Just want to address that it should be the other way around. It shouldn't be Jesus becoming the American. It should be America becoming like God. It should become Christian. And that's the purpose of integralism, is the other way around. It's supposed to be the government submitting to the church as the true authority, because the spiritual authority has more authority and power than the temporal authority.
Okay, so how does that look practically speaking?
Well, I could go to the medieval age, but we have them still practiced today in a few countries. But how it would basically roll is that the government would normally have Catholics running it, or I would say normally because they have to submit to the Pope as the universal authority based on his spiritual power. Because as Jesus said on his ascension, it was all power on heaven and on earth has been therefore given unto me. And so the Pope as the vicar of Christ would be having the all power of heaven and earth being given unto him.
Okay, so let me back up just a little. So we're talking about integralism now. We left Christian nationalism behind. That's not something that we would want to hold hold up as a
Catholics,
good,
I would say.
And now we're on integralism, and you're saying that it's sort of a way of thinking that would have the church as a guide. Is that, or
is the church as the spiritual authority? It would be inherently Christian, and actually it is doctrine of the Catholic Church. The two swords doctrine by Pope Gelasius, where he would actually said that there are two swords, the temporal sword and the spiritual sword, and that the spiritual sword has more weight than the temporal sword. And so that there is a difference between the two. There's the School of Salamanca wanted to divide the difference between the power of the temporal sword and the power of the spiritual sword. But the case was here that the power of the spiritual sword has more authority than the temporal sword, not because the Pope has like two swords with him, but rather it's that the one sword, the spiritual sword, has more power than the temporal sword, and the temporal sword must submit to the spiritual sword.
Now, who did you say is sort of behind this integralism? Presenting it?
Well, I would say it was I want to say practice, but more really, it was the guy who formulated it. It was Pope Gelasius, however you pronounce it. Okay. He's the one who explained the two swords doctrine, and it was formulated in the medieval ages from a system called hierarchy. But then some people have taken it a little too far with Gallicanism, although I think that's more like the original Catholic nationalism, which I don't exactly remember, but I would say that it's, whatever the case be, the church doesn't support Gallicanism.
So pretend like I don't know anything about this, and tell me a little bit about how you would explain this, maybe like if I were a younger child and you wanted to just kind of give me the the basics of integralism.
Okay, so the church, or the government really, recognizes the Catholic Church as the official church of the nation. It is the official religion. Catholicism is going to be what the government will support, and no
Okay.
other. And so, in that case, when they make laws, it has to fit within the natural law as taught by the Catholic Church. It cannot contradict Catholic morals. It cannot even contradict religion as well. The government must, by the support of the church, support Catholicism, and it must, by the power of the church at least, suppress heresy. When I say that, I mean the government can't do it by its own power. That's a spiritual problem. That only the church can command the government to do that, if that is the case. The thing is that the point is to protect the common good. Sometime, because St. Thomas Aquinas, this is where I get really controversial, but I have to get it over with. St. Thomas Aquinas actually wrote in the Summa that because if it's right to kill if the death penalty is okay for someone who has committed forgery, or at least in the modern case, who deserves the death penalty, it would be more deserving for a heretic because he has sent someone to hell, and going to hell is worse than death. But the thing, and so he would say they do in fact deserve the death penalty, but the church didn't necessarily say that was no longer the case, but rather they're not going to take that approach because they know that the purpose of the government is to support the common good. And if you actually sent a heretic to death now, you're going to cause a riot, and that's going to destroy the common good. So prudently, it's best not to do that, especially in a religiously diverse nation like the United States. And in the case here also is that but the church can still at least have the government support the Catholic religion. Then also they would tolerate back then they would actually just tolerate the religions, but toleration didn't mean sanctioning. They say toleration just in case that it supports the common good without sanctioning it. Like for example, if we recognize Catholicism as the official religion, then Protestant churches would be tolerated, but they wouldn't be sanctioned, meaning they would be not having certain privileges like working in the government, or maybe they have to pay some taxes.
So what is, like, in discussing this, how, because we're in a Protestant nation, how is this just some way to look at, I guess, how would you recommend people viewing integralism? Because it's something that it doesn't seem like we could actually do in our country.
I mean, I would say it's doctrinal, but the church has taught that not everything that is true can be enforced. For example, like when the people say Vatican II supported religious liberty, they didn't say the freedom to worship whatever you want. They said the freedom to worship. Period. That's just worshiping. That's like just a fundamentality of what it means to be a human. And the thing is that it even has said in that same document from the Second Vatican Council that it leaves traditional Catholic teachings untouched. And the point here is that in a religious nation, like for example, I'm sure we remember when we're doing that death penalty talk, and I said the death penalty. Also, by the way, this is like a separate talk outside the radio show.
Okay.
But when we were doing that talk, we were talking about how that the death penalty is not necessary in every single case, even if deserving. And so in this case for integralism, is that even if it is true for the sake of the common good, it may not always be enforced because for example, in the United States, it's so Protestant that doing it now would be impractical. It would be good, but it can't be possible, at least in the moment. And so this is what the United States ought to recognize the Catholic Church as the official church of the United States, but at the moment it can't do it.
Yeah, and it's also, I think, also important to consider that, like, political entities, I guess, like the practical implementation of integralism would not be necessarily the solution, whereas the solution is the conversion of the people in the country, the adoption of Catholicism, and the conversion to the true religion. And then those political structures come as a fruit of that. Because, as a fruit of having a Catholic nation, you want to have a Catholic government and one that implements the social teachings of the church. And that's really how it went in Europe. It was first there came the conversion of the tribes of Europe, and then building on that was the Catholic society that you had elements of integralism and all that.
Actually, I don't think that was the case. I remember having Dr. Pecknell gave a talk. He said it was actually the other way around. First the king converted, and then the people converted. And I would say the government was the one that did the conversion. So I would say in this case the United States ought to, even if the people wouldn't. But the fact is that they need to be prudent on how to apply it. For example, you can't, for example, the point of integralism is not to force conversion. This is not a theocracy. Because a theocracy would be the unification of both spiritual and temporal. But the thing is, they're both divided. So in this case, that the temporal must submit to the spiritual, but the spiritual has to recognize the temporal has its own proper powers, and the temporal authority cannot force conversion because that would be actually the power of the spiritual sword, which it does not possess.
So what I think, though, Nicholas is saying at that time, the kings kind of determined how the country would go, but now it's not like that. Now we sort of have a grassroots where we actually would have to have a majority of the people in our country kind of converting because we don't have a king status. We don't have that monarchical setup, right? Is that what you kind of saying, Nicholas, that if we were to ever think of implementing something like integralism, we'd have to begin, and I think that's the goal anyway, ultimately as Catholics, is to bring, conversion, help other people to see the gospel message and to convert.
Unfortunately, I would say that trying to start it as a grassroots would be inherently Protestant. That would be Christian nationalism, going from the ground up. We believe in Jesus, who actually, well, they do too, but we believe Jesus has actually sent power not from ground up, but up down. He sent it from heaven to earth.
Okay.
So that would be the power of the spiritual sword. So therefore, it wouldn't go from bottom up; it would go from up down. Although we would also have to convert the people still. And at the same time, and even the church has taught, and even St. Thomas Aquinas has even taught this, that the conversion should not be coerced from the government. It should be from the people. They should be from the faithful.
And that's what I was implying.
Right.
Yes.
Like the conversion of people.
There has to be conversion of people. We have to have the free will, right? And there has to be free will conversion, but there has to be... So I'm getting sort of two different thoughts here. So that's what I thought we were saying is we have to convert people's hearts, but you can't really force conversion.
We cannot, and unfortunately, there's a lot of Catholics who think that integralists are inherently fascist. The only problem is that to be fascist would be to have the church submit to the state. That's literally not fascism. I mean, no, that the church submitting to the state is fascism. What we're supporting is the other way around, where the state submits to the church. So we have to be careful with when talking, because while talking about this, especially in the modern world, where the idea of church-state relations seems a little silly, there's still some places that practice it, like Liechtenstein, Malta, well, obviously Vatican City, but mostly it's micronations. Some nations still recognize Jesus in the Constitution. I believe Argentina is one of them. But the thing is that a lot of people say, why can't we just do natural law? Why can't we just practice natural law according to how the government teaches? Or like you can reason out natural law. The only problem is that we can reason out, but it can't be guaranteed if this is basically the right context of what natural law means. And the reason why we need a church is that it would help us provide the orthodox interpretation of natural law. Sure, we can give out good ideas of what natural law is. The only problem is that it takes a while to come up with a proper understanding of natural law. The church already has the full understanding of it, and it'll be more guaranteed to protecting the common good in that case. Also, want to be a little careful when it comes to like Pope Pius IX giving out that syllabus of errors, where it said that people ought not to be heretics. Well, obviously no one should, but he was giving out in more of a political context. And the thing is that technically that is true, and religiously, spiritually and temporally, no one ought to be a heretic. The only problem is that he's correct, but applying it in the modern world where everything's now religiously plural is really tough. A lot of people say the United States shouldn't be recognizing religion; all of them should be accepted. Only problem is that that's actually permitting the error, and error has no rights. That's something I want to actually mention. The point of an opinion is that Opinion is it's neither right nor wrong. It's your own personal subjection. But the thing is that there's also fact, which is actually inherently right, and error, which is inherently wrong. And so when it comes to rights, you can't really have the right to something that's inherently wrong. Like, for example, I don't think you should have a teacher who should teach students that 7 plus 7 equals 49. That's technically 7 times 7, but 7 plus 7 is not 49, it's 14. But the teacher says, I have my right to say 7 plus 7 is 49. Only thing is that that's wrong, and you can't have a right to something that's not inherently correct, because what is correct is, I would say, more positive, but what's wrong is negative, and what's annihilated is not existing. And so if you can't give a right to something that doesn't even exist at all, neither should you give a right to error. It's not even possible. Error has no rights. And so when it comes to Protestantism, I'm sorry to say this to a lot of Americans, but according to the Two Swords Doctrine, Protestant churches ought not to have any rights, because error has no rights. It can be tolerated, but no right. So it has to be carefully applied, though, because this is one of those very controversial Catholic doctrines, but at the same time, if we believe the church is the true church, we ought to treat it as it is, the true church. It's tough to say it right now, but at the same time, we live in a world of relativism, and if we need truth, we have to get kind of ugly about it.
You're listening to Studio on Christ Our King Radio, Catholic radio for Acadiana, 90.5 and 99.5 FM and 1230 AM. And we want to thank Stein Lumber for being our sponsor and sponsoring our show every Thursday at 4. We're your local lay Dominicans out of Our Lady of Wisdom. And we also, our patron is St. Albert the Great. And today we're looking at something that St. Albert the Great might even scratch his head on a little bit. And it's one of those things that are hard to get, I guess, understand completely. You grapple with the idea or the theory of some of these. Would you call it a political theory or a governing theory? What would you call it? A philosophy of governing?
It would say, like, in a way, yes, but it's more theological, because the church, again, this is the Church of Jesus Christ.
Now, do you think it's something that people should know about, integralism?
I'm sure a lot of people already know about it now, but sometimes they conflate it with Christian nationalism. And again, like, just want to be careful, because I know I said we had to get ugly about this, but at the same time, that charity is important. You cannot be uncharitable integralist. It will be bad. But also, but part of the point of integralism is actually supposed to be more in line with the government recognizing that Jesus Christ is King of Kings and Lord of Lords, and that's actually technically doctrinal. And so if it's doctrinal and everyone ought to believe it, so ought the political body ought to believe it. I mean, the heavenly body recognizes it, and even hell, all of hell recognizes that Jesus is King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And so it's basically the affirmation of reality. I know it's a little bit tough to understand, or at least tough to hard to swallow. St. Albert the Great, not sure if when he scratched his head, all I know is that St. Thomas Aquinas was the one who gave out the heretics ought to deserve death, so I'm pretty sure he would have been tough on that as well. Yes, it was the medieval ages. Oh, and just for context, the Albigensian heresy was encouraging people to commit suicide, because that was actually part of their doctrine, where the body was so inherently evil it has to be destroyed. So the church sent the Crusades to actually stop that, and so that didn't really work out well, so the Dominicans started the medieval Inquisition to put an end to it. And putting it in that context, if you tolerated the heresy, you would have had so many people committing suicide, and that is something that we wouldn't even support that today. Like the Jim Jones incident, we wouldn't have supported his heresy that actually encouraged suicide. And in this case, no one would have done that for the Albigensian heresy either. It would have made more sense to suppress that heresy. Heresies today, I don't know if it would have been prudent to suppress them. It depends probably on the situation. but because the common good was actually being destroyed by the Albigensian heresy, the church actually was right to try to suppress it because it was actually killing people.
So how do you think knowing a little bit about this would help people, like, in everyday, or at least when they go to vote or when they go to think about politics or just living their vocation? Is there something about this that would help people to live their faith within that,
Well, I would say you have to follow the common good, even if, well, let's say you're voting as a Catholic and there's a Protestant, but the Protestant is actually more Catholic than the Catholic, because the Catholic is more. I'm just gonna keep this. I'm not trying to like make any comparisons. Let's say a Catholic who is supporting things that are inherently evil, the Protestant who does not support things inherently evil. Maybe he supports some things that are inherently evil, but if it's less than the situation, St. Thomas Aquinas even mentioned this: if you have two evils you can't avoid, you have to choose the lesser of those two evils. Then, so in this case, if the Protestant is actually going to be more likely to protect the common good, you would have to vote for the Protestant, even if the Catholic actually recognizes the true church. And so it's tough in this situation, sad too, but it kind of shows the problem of not recognizing the authority of the church. And in that case, it's the Catholic who claims to believe in the true church, but doesn't take its authority seriously. So I guess you can say the big point of integralism is authority of the church.
Yeah, and it's interesting you said that, Matthew, because in a commentary on Pinocchio Pinocchio's by Carlo Collodi, but there's a commentary on that with reflections on a father's love by Franco Nembrini. And in that, he says, the church does not defend its own freedom, which no one will ever succeed in taking away. The resounding fact is that the very presence of the church defends everybody's freedom because every other form of power is relativized alongside it.
And just as a side note, when we're talking about integralism, but we're talking about the Catholic definition, and not to be confused with a relatively recent, in the 1930s, there was a political movement in Brazil who also called themselves the Integralists, but this, is not what we're talking about there. That was a fascist movement from the 1930s, and it has nothing really in common with what we're talking about other than the name. So just as a clarification, because, if you don't want someone to start Googling it and find that and wonder what the connection is, there really is no connection. It's just a separate movement altogether. So Thomas Crean has a book on integralism. I haven't read it in its fullness yet, but I've gone through parts of it, and in the summary of kind of trying to explain what is integralism, and I guess particularly from the lens of an American who lives in the modern age, where a lot of times the medieval political context sounds very foreign to us, kind of in our current era and where we are. A kind of good way of looking at it that he had mentioned, I believe, was to see it as the implementation of Catholic social teaching in the political space. So I guess kind of what that could mean for us now is like a lot of times we tend to frame politics around personalities, around specific politicians, around parties, and not as much a discussion on like the policies themselves and which one and judging the policies in and of themselves. And whenever we do, we tend to do it in a very how would I put this? A very unprofessional way in the public discourse. And I would say to kind of the way we should be looking at it is, okay, this particular policy, what would the church is teaching through the eyes of the church and through Catholic social teaching, what would be the morally right way to do it? And then to go backwards from there, say, okay, who is advocating for this solution that's closest to the Catholic social teaching? I think that's what you were saying earlier. It's kind of like, whereas you might have a case where the Protestant is more Catholic than the Catholic, and that might be, you might end up with a situation where it's similar to that. And again, it's it's kind of like we were saying, it's kind of sad and confusing, but at the end of the day, that might be the solution. That at least in the intermediary, in the current time. Obviously, a choice of none. Very few times do we have the perfect solution or the perfect person or the perfect policy to implement. But I mean, we live in an imperfect world, so sometimes the best we can get is the best we can get.
And I can say that I think the main lesson here is actually humility, because the point of humility is not necessarily putting yourself down, but recognizing an authority over you, and at least a legitimate authority at least. And the point here would be the government actually practicing humility by recognizing that there is in fact an institution higher than itself, one that was actually established by God himself in Jesus Christ. Or Jesus Christ, not God in Jesus, but he is Jesus. And the whole Trinity thing can get confusing here. But that point here is the government recognizing that this is, in fact, God's church. We are not Mount Zion. And that is, in fact, humility. And also there is no no harshness to Protestants, because I actually have Protestant friends. The reason why I'm actually being light on the whole death penalty thing is because I knew that I would actually not like seeing them hurt. And that's what got me thinking about, would the common good be more destroyed if we actually practice this? So that's why I said it shouldn't be practiced all the time. I would say it would only be done if it is actually inherently destroying the common good, like Albigensianism, for example. Although death doesn't actually always have to be the case in that case. Well, unless St. Thomas Aquinas makes his point about the whole going to hell being worse than death, which technically is.
So the humility, when we go back to that, there was something else that you had said earlier.
I was talking about humility, recognizing that there's an authority over you. You don't beat yourself. Humility is not beating yourself up, but recognizing there's one who has more power than you. No, not necessarily more power than you, who's probably more better than you, I guess you can say. And I would say the church doesn't have. Okay, I'm not saying like the church has authorities that are better than you morally. You can probably be better than them. It just means more recognizing their position as higher than yours because of their sacred status, I would say. Because technically, being a priest, even if he's an immoral priest, his status is actually sacred, and so you have to recognize that.
So, is there anything else that you'd want people to like? What would you recommend for people? Nicholas, I know you think people should be politically in the know, right? At least know something about what's happening in their government and be able to participate. What would you recommend for people who, don't feel like they have access to that truthful information? Because what you said earlier is, we have this freedom, but there's no freedom. I mean, error shouldn't have this. It shouldn't be out there as a right. We can't just go out and lie. That's just not a freedom.
It's not.
That's something that, I don't know, is deceptive and misleading. I think that's something that's confusing for people too.
Yeah, a lot of it would have to really understand it and to really embrace it for what it is. You really have to, and as Americans, this is pretty hard, is kind of divest ourselves of a lot of the Enlightenment philosophies that introduced a lot of our really wrong ways of thinking about government and kind of that backwards view of government that unfortunately has been in the American political philosophy since the beginning. So honestly, understanding the differences there and maybe even going back and seeing, okay, where did those original philosophers, like Locke and all the others of those eras, where did they go wrong and why does what they say conflict with the church? And that is kind of like where you can start saying, okay, where do we need to go from there? How should I change my thinking, to conform more to the teachings of the church and not to these flawed philosophies?
That's why I mentioned the School of Salamanca. They actually seem like the better alternative to the Enlightenment philosophy, where they almost said the same thing except they actually put it in a Catholic context. And they're actually it's scholastic. It's Spanish scholasticism from what I knew. And I would say what I would say is for people, when it comes to converting people, you have to tell the truth, and even if it gets ugly, but you have to also be charitable, because they will not be converting if you present an ugly truth and are unkind about it as well.
That's definitely something you need to depend on grace. Always knowing that you should stand for truth ultimately, and remember to stand firm in the absolute truth, Jesus Christ, because only the truth bears grace.
Lived through time, passed through fire, broke my heart.